Hey everybody, welcome, welcome to this week's Left Reckoning. I was going to make a little snazzy intro video like Matt does every week, but part of me felt like it's not nice to mess with somebody else's art. Just me solo this week. Matt is hanging out on vacation. Hope he's having a good time, but we're going to have a lot of fun here tonight. We got a lot coming to y'all in a little bit. We're going to be releasing the interview I did earlier this week with Natalie Shure. Natalie Shure is just one of those people. If you're not already following her, she is a must follow on Twitter. Even more importantly, find her work and read it. She writes about everything from health policy to some really, really nifty things for these up and coming socialist magazines like Jacobin. We're going to be talking about her piece in Jacobin in the most recent print edition of the magazine. So be sure to subscribe to the magazine too to get that on AOC, on the end of the AOC honeymoon, sort of breaking down this history, which in a way feels like it's been a really long time since she got elected. But when you actually remember that, we're talking about 2018. A lot has happened in these past 4 years. So really interesting and fun conversation, sort of dealing with, what can we expect from elected officials? Where is the organization? the DSA, when it comes to sort of cultivating and building relationships and projecting their power on the national level. It's a really, really fun and enlightening conversation. And then a little bit later, we're going to be joined by friend and comrade Dr. Ben Burgess. He'll be joining us in the post game. So subscribe at patreon.com/leftreckoning to get access to that. We'll be taking voicemails, DMs. So really excited to hear from all of y'all in the post game as well. But hell yeah. Well, there's a few things I wanted to get to before we get to this Natalie piece. The first thing I just want to say up at the top is, solidarity with the people who have been affected in Ukraine, particularly by this really horrific bombing and shelling of a maternity ward in a hospital and a children's ward in a hospital. The images are coming out of that are just absolutely horrific, as we've seen many, many other horrific scenes across the country of Ukraine. But I did want to note that up at the top because we point these things out when America targets hospitals and children and mothers. And I think it's also very important to make sure that we're doing the same here. It's certainly absolutely heartbreaking. And I think we're probably talking with Ben a little bit more about Ukraine and things like that in the post game. But I just want to make sure that we're getting to that up off the top. But on the other side, there is some good news, some things that I think are worth celebrating while we can, because we have these really, really exciting movements that are going on across the country. And I think it's worthwhile celebrating and making sure that we can find ways to support them. So first things first, the continuation of this really historic on so many levels, but push within Starbucks to form unions all across the country. I just wanted to shout out the most recent example of this in my hometown of Austin, Texas, where employees at Austin Starbucks store unionizing say they've experienced an erosion of trust. Employees at Austin Starbucks locations are unionizing, according to a letter posted to social media Monday. The store can be found downtown West Campus near the University of Texas at Austin. The workers, also known as partners, I always love that spin they put on it, said one of the reasons they are declaring a union petition is because the location is mostly run by students with certain needs. Our store, comprised mainly of UT Austin students, presents unique scheduling challenges, the partners explained in the letter addressed to Starbucks CEO Kevin Johnson. Now, we want to find ways to support them. So look in your local community to find ways to get involved. It has to be noted that Starbucks is already cracking down. We've talked about the ways that Starbucks has been changing the way that their scheduling system works, finding kind of BS reasons to fire union organizers. This is a time when it is as important as ever to keep your eyes and ears glued to information about local organizing movements at Starbucks in your community, because Starbucks is trying to get away with using some of the nastiest tactics in the book, to get rid of union organizers and to smash this union. The exciting thing, though, is that as as they target individuals, more and more people stand up collectively, and more of these drives are popping up across the country. That's a very, very encouraging sign, and we need to continue to celebrate that and find ways to get involved. So shout out, a little TMBS throwback to the Starbucks organizers here in Austin and all across the country. I also want to shout out, before we get to the opening commentary, too, our teachers in Minneapolis, who are going out and they are standing up against just the complete war on a democratic good, something that should make, that we should all recognize as a part of our collective, a part of our community, our education system. This here from CNN: Minneapolis educators go on strike, canceling school for more than 30,000 students. Minneapolis educators began striking Tuesday after failing to reach a deal with Minneapolis public schools, canceling classes indefinitely for more than 30,000 students. The Minneapolis Federation of Teachers and Education Support Professionals are seeking a living wage for ESPs, lowering class sizes, and for safe and stable schools. According to a post on the teachers union's Facebook page, goals that were clearly spelled out Tuesday morning on picketers' signs outside Justice Page Middle School in southern Minneapolis. So solidarity and shout out to all the teachers who are going out on strike there. I mean, despite all of the shit that people have been going through, I mean, I just can't express how exciting it has been to see this uptick in militancy, particularly amongst teachers who have been, put on the front lines of this COVID pandemic, as the government, for the most part, has completely failed us. It's been really inspiring to see teachers organizing and standing up against these really, really brutal systems, from Minneapolis to Chicago and all across the country. So shout out to them as well. But y'all, there's a lot of different things that we could talk about this week, and since it was just me, I wanted to find something in the kind of David fashion that was both topical and sort of future focused, right? Because we are in the midst of multiple crises, right? But I really wanted to talk and to break down how not to talk about climate change, because it's something that is it's a crisis that is certainly so important, and you can feel it, and a lot of people get very depressed when they recognize that there just really isn't very much being done. A lot of people get extremely moralistic about it instead of materialistic about it, in the sense of people think about these things being individual moral choices versus what they really are systemic choices that we need to organize collectively to tackle. And they certainly, climate change and the things that drive it rub up against almost everything that we talk about on this program, right? From workers' power to anti-imperialism, to organizing. And we'll talk more on the show about the invasion of Ukraine later. But when it comes to climate change, this has undoubtedly reminded people of the politics of fossil fuels, right? You're seeing things like the Dutch government, for example, saying it's unfortunate, but they can't get away from Russian oil. And the Americans, right? Offering to partially end their stranglehold on the people of Venezuela, so that they can up production there to maybe keep gas prices lower in the United States, right? I mean, you can see really how the business of fossil fuel and fossil fuel production plays a major role in international and national politics, right? It's not a surprise to most people, but this is one moment where it's extremely visceral when you're starting to see all these fissures developing around this issue. Now, one would hope, though, when this gets sort of brought up to so many people, that this would be a window for better rhetoric. But what I can see, from what I can see, it's the right and the fossil fuel industry that are winning this moment, right? as more and more people, particularly in the US, are open to this rhetoric of the temporary need to drill, 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 right? I've talked a lot about how the American Petroleum Institute has really been using this crisis to try to push and argue for Biden to allow them to drill more and more. And what has the Biden administration's response been? Bragging about the insanity and the climate denial policy that they've been pushing, which has allowed more oil and gas permits on publicly owned lands than Trump or Obama or Bush, right? That's something that the current administration is bragging about. Remember all this kind of rattling we were hearing in 2020 about, believe the science? It's amazing how quickly that gets thrown out of the window for political expediency, right? So we're getting that kind of, disaster boiling up in the Biden administration. And what are we getting from other members of his policy? We're getting this kind of visionless nonsense from Biden's climate fella, John Kerry, who was in Houston this week, who was shouting platitudes to the fossil fuel industry about natural gas and reminding the fossil fuel industry that they are in the driver's seat. This is a direct quote from John Kerry in Houston this week, where he said, "No government in the world has enough money to implement this transition," noting we absolutely need the industry at the table. Now, he mixed that in with, moral calls for them to do something, and even some kind of, business logic, saying that if sea levels rise, that's going to hurt the business cycle. I'll tell you this right now, y'all. All you need to do to see how far moral appeals go with fossil fuel companies is to drive across West Texas, New Mexico, and Louisiana and see the devastation that has been caused by those industries in those areas and see the devastation that continues to happen because of unplugged wells. We can send them all the pictures and photographs and letters about how evil that they're being and how they need to have a heart and do something for the people, right, who are suffering. They just turn their backs and move on and count their money. The fact is that the status quo is going to let it all burn. So we can't let them. But what is this future going to look like? What is this future in climate change going to look like? What is a future of, a kind of neoliberal solution to climate change going to look like? We can go through all of the dire warnings, right, about what's going to happen to the environment, to communities, to sea levels. And those are serious and important. But at a certain point, it's really important to start looking at the class dynamics that are at play here. People like to say the line, it's socialism or barbarism. And we need to really look at what that will mean for people. Now, I'm going to share this right quick. And I know this is, tongue in cheek and a joke and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not here to get really worked up about what some people find funny or not. But this does reveal a certain kind of mentality that I think is too dominant, particularly on the green liberal side. But I also see it creeping in to people who consider themselves to be pro-worker socialists. This is not the only version of this. This is just the one that I'm going to show. This is this gentleman, Hamish Mitchell. Doesn't matter too much. Just shooting the shit. And he says, the national average for a gallon of gas is $4.17. A gallon of Starbucks coffee costs $16.80. Just saying, right? And this isn't the only kind of Starbucks level economist that we've had this week talking about the very, very real thing, which has been a very quick and rapid and devastating increase in gas prices. Look, gas is going up, and that hurts working people. It does. And you might not be in a situation where it affects you directly, particularly if you live maybe in a city that has a functioning or working public transportation system. But for millions upon millions of Americans, when gas goes up, it really hurts them. And yes, we need to get off of a system that's attached to fossil fuels. But if you're going to try to sit here and put your head in the sand and finger wag at people who are struggling, you are a big part of the fucking problem at this point. If you've never been a working person in this country, And I think a lot of people who listen to this show recognize this feeling, right? I've had it too. What it is like when you've had to worry about how you're going to afford to get to work this week, you need to sit down, right? If you were worried about not being able to pay for your transportation, if that is not a worry that you've experienced in your life, it is time for you to shut up and listen. If you get to pick which neighborhood you get to live in, right? Because that's a nice walkability score, instead of picking where you live based on the basic dollars and cents of what you can afford, I really don't want to hear it. When these prices go up, they hurt people, right? And look, when Larry Summers, who was all up in arms earlier about inflation, stops caring and tells people they need to make hard choices between food and fuel as a patriotic duty, you should listen and ask yourself, what side are you on? And here's the Larry Summers quote here. Former Treasury Secretary says, even $5 gas is worth it, worth paying to stop Putin, right? Saying something like that when you've seen the way that our government treats the very real concerns and needs of the American people, both throughout the entire history of this pandemic, and even going into this most recent week. Look at this right here. Tell me how patriotic you feel about this kind of shit. Dems set for House approval of Ukraine aid, drops COVID funds. So the United States government is unable to provide people. We're not even talking minimum. This is sub-minimum stuff of making sure people have access to vaccines who need it, making sure that people have access to testing, etc. We're not talking about the more radical things. They're not even radical. The basic things that people need, which is a check from the government to continue to help them climb out of the hole that they've fallen into over these past few years, as people have been suffering, right? If it is the patriotic duty, of people to accept higher prices, the government should be stepping in to help out the people who need it most, right? The greatest trick that the neoliberals and the people in power in the society have played is to turn a societal crisis into a personal one. Let me say that again. The neoliberal model has tricked people into seeing a societal crisis. Climate change is a societal crisis. It's not a personal crisis. It's not an individual crisis. It is a crisis that is caused by the system and the structures that we live in. Neoliberals have tricked people into considering this and thinking about this problem on a personal and an individual level, right? In the neoliberal logic, the destruction, which is the destruction of the collective, the destruction of society. Remember Margaret Thatcher's famous line, there is no society, there's only individuals and families, right? It has had one of its greatest victories in the kind of green consensus or environmentalist movement. Look, there is no doubt about it that we need to lower our reliance on fossil fuels. It's as urgent as ever. But we will not get there until we address the reasons why people in the United States of America need to use personal vehicles to get around. And you won't get there if you don't recognize that for years upon years, the fossil fuel industry and the automotive industry have played big games with the government to basically destroy any form of public transportation and to promote highways and extremely spaced out centers where people live, right? That is the contemporary reality for the vast majority of people in this country, right? Now, I know not everybody lives like that. I know some people who live in New York or some parts of Seattle, etc., Chicago, they might not be as reliant as people in Jacksonville or in Tuscaloosa, on a personal vehicle to get around. But again, this is the reality for a vast majority of people. And if you want to change that reality, you need to be advocating in a serious way, not in a kind of finger-wagging, scolding way, for a real investment and not just public transportation in urban metros, right? But transportation solutions for people all across the country. We need real investment in transportation. We need real investment in retrofitting our buildings. We need nuclear, y'all. And we need a democratically controlled power grid. because and I know it's funny to dunk on somebody who drives an F-350 with, a 10-inch lift kit, who rolls coal all the time. Those people, frankly, they drive me crazy too, right? Um, but that person, just even if they're guzzling up gas, are not the real people who are standing between us and real climate legislation, right? That is the fossil fuel industry. That is all the people who are complicit, which is the vast majority of Congress, in protecting their power. And yeah, that is people like John Kerry who have no vision or idea of how to really tackle this thing, except for saying, we want to make sure that the fossil fuel industry has a seat at the table, right? Go and listen to what Shell is putting out. For example, Shell Oil. They have a whole podcast page you can listen to. We've done it. I did a Griscom stream on a little while ago where they talk very seriously about climate change and green energy and all these things. But they do it in a way that will always protect the investments that they have made in continuing to drill and continuing to sell, refine, and produce oil for mass consumption, right? That is what we will get um, with the carry model. So what will happen is poor people, working people, will have to pay higher taxes, will have to pay higher rates on gasoline, right? Well, wealthier people can make this transition into electric cars, hybrids, more fuel efficient vehicles, right? The burden will fall on everyday people, while the wealthy, the upper middle class, will get to wipe their hands clean out of that, feel morally superior to the people who work for them, right? uh, while really at the end of the day, very, very little significant has been done to really curtail the worst effects of climate change, right? Because this is a systemic crisis, this is a societal crisis. Until you start to deal with it on those terms, we won't get anywhere. This kind of hyper focus on individual individual purchases, individual consumption choices is a way for the organizations and the forces, right? That's fossil fuel capital, and that is the American government for the vast majority of its history over the past 100 years. Has been absolutely complicit in making this current reality, where people are dependent on fossil fuels. And if you don't want to come up with a solution, if you don't want to be promoting solutions that find a way to help out the vast majority of people, right, get out of this crisis, but rather find a way for a small group of individuals to enjoy a little bit of moral superiority for to the the uncaring masses, right? We're just not on the same side. Because what's also coming, right, and this is attached to the fossil fuel, and to cars and driving and public transportation. What is also coming is a Musk style small is beautiful bullshit. Little co-op solar for the nice neighborhoods and dirty failing grids for the rest of us. They are selling this kind of nice, feel good climate solution for the wealthy. You see it all the time. I'm sure you see it in your areas. They're promoting it like crazy here. The personal house battery, right? Maybe have your own personal way to produce your own electricity, right? That's not a real solution for a large crisis like global energy production and climate change. That's a personal solution so that you can opt out of society, right? The true realization of a kind of neoliberal model of dealing with a massive crisis like climate change. Do it yourself and for your family. Screw everybody else. Yeah, and have your personal choice, right? You get to decouple yourself from the grid, while the rest of us, suffer under uh, dirty electrical grids that are failing, as you've seen that happened here in Texas, and it's coming for a lot of other people too, unfortunately. What we need is democratic control of our electrical grid for expansion, and a real investment into it, and for those things to actually work for the people and not just to make profit for a small group of folks. We need a Green New Deal that is not just a slogan, but it's a political movement. It's one that recognizes that the crisis we are in is caused by the system of private profit, of exploitation of the many. We need, for example, a just transition to go from being a slogan is a good idea, but a lot of people, it's still just a slogan for them, to a commitment, a real commitment to working people and understanding their issues. I can't tell you anything that is more out of touch with that reality than pushing something like, um, you know, dealing with climate change as a personal lifestyle choice or an aesthetic, right? Because that's what they want. That's what Kerry wants. That's what Biden wants. That's what Larry Summers wants. And that's certainly what Exxon wants. Exxon wants to have a seat at the table, right? While we're all sort of pushed out, while they're busting unions across the state of Texas to try to destroy unionized labor in the fossil fuel industry here. While green liberals sit around and instead of trying to attack the structures that are creating this crisis, sit around and wag their fingers at poor people and working class people who are worried about the fact that if the price of gasoline goes up, it means that they have to make other hard choices in their life, right? That is a perfect solution for us to never really deal with this crisis because the rich will be able to opt out. The rich already are opting out. And we need to start uniting, or else we will be left with the tab. That's what they're doing. You don't have to look too far to see who ends up paying for the devastation of these companies. As I noted earlier, if you look across this state, you see what happens when the fossil fuel industry leaves. They leave environmental devastation, certainly economic devastation, and they don't give a shit. And then guess who has to pay for the cleanup of the unplugged wells, for the cleanup from the devastation in their communities? People and the government, right? That is what we will get if we don't start getting serious about a real class-based, working class-based movement that takes seriously the power structures that got us into this situation today. And the only way that you're going to be able to build that is with real solidarity and understanding of the reality of people who might be different than you. Politics is necessarily about building powerful and large coalitions. We have the advantage that people who work for a wage and people who work for a living is something that unites far, far, far more people than it excludes. And we need to be utilizing that and recognizing that's going to mean building coalitions across geography and culture and language, so that we can address this group of people, the capitalist class, the owners class, the people who are invested. People don't recognize how much money is still invested in futures and oil, right? They need to get paid for the investment that they've already made. And if you don't have a political movement that's strong enough to deal with that, right, they will always veto you. And they will certainly veto you if instead of uniting and finding ways to build a real pro-Green New Deal movement, a just transition movement, a class-based green environmental movement, we will be sitting on the outside while they are carving up a really, really luscious future for them and giving us scraps and environmental devastation. We need to build a movement that doesn't want people to suffer for the profits of big corporations and for the security of the state. But we need to build one that wants to radically shift who is in power and who gets a say. There's a lot more that we could say on that, but it's just something that I think is really important for us to do that kind of reflection, as we're growing and recognizing that old playbook is just not going to work for us. I hope to be able to cover more of that in the near future with y'all. I'm going to flip over to the Natalie Shure interview in just a second, and this is a really fun conversation. We're sort of breaking down the reality. Sorry, the history of. She's breaking down. She's the author here. She's in her article, which you can read in Jacobin. She goes through the history of. She goes through the history of AOC and the kind of major moments in. The major moments in her kind of political trajectory, most importantly in her relationship to the left. So we talk a little bit about force to vote. We don't focus on it. We talk about Israel. We talk about her relationship to Bernie Sanders. And then we sort of end by talking about all of the the real structural issues that are within DSA when it comes to that. But before we get there, I just want to remind folks on the other side. I'll come back on for a moment, but then I'll be going to the post game with Ben Burgess. We'll be taking y'all's voicemails, y'all's DMs. If you sign up on Patreon, you'll get that number. It's in all the posts. So please leave us a voicemail. Can't wait to hear from y'all. You also can ask us DM questions in the Discord. You get all of that and a bonus episode each week and much, much, much more at patreon.com/Left Reckoning. I would really love if we could hit 1,000 subscribers soon so that we can get Matt Leck here to Austin. But without any further ado, here's the interview with Natalie Shure. There were some issues with our connectivity, so I'm sorry. There's a couple moments where it gets a little jumpy. We don't edit our interviews here, but I had to do some cuts just to fix sound and things like that. Anyway, I'll see y'all on the other side. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome back, everybody. Left Reckoning. Just David this time. Matt is soaking up the sun in Spain. Lucky guy. But we have a really fun conversation coming up for y'all. The AOC issue is one that's like probably one of the more interesting, I think, conversations to have on the left. It's also one conversation that probably gets the most cartoonish extremely quickly. Their entire brands right now and media followings are pretty much just dedicated to sort of attacking AOC as a neoliberal shill. And while I think that is ridiculous, there are some real tensions within the left, particularly, this burgeoning democratic socialist movement and AOC, who is a political superstar. And we need to question the relationship that she has with the base that she is most publicly associated with. But to talk about that a little bit more in depth, we have Natalie Shure here. Natalie Shure is a columnist at the New Republic. You can also find her work in The Nation, Prospect, and a punchy little magazine called Jacobin, where she just wrote a really wonderful piece. Y'all should also subscribe to the magazine. I just re-upped my subscription to read this piece, The End of the AOC Honeymoon. Thank you so much, Natalie, for hanging out today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about AOC and this history here. But before we sort of zoom in into any particular moments, what do you mean when you're talking about this honeymoon, and what are we really seeing the end of here?
Yeah, so the piece is called The End of the AOC Honeymoon, but I don't think you can tell the story without talking about Bernie first. I think looking at the state of the contemporary left, you see that there really wasn't a significant left before 2016, at least that was, relevant on the national political stage. And we know that what changed that is that a senator from Vermont decided to run for the presidency on a lark and ended up doing extremely well, outperforming all expectations, and I think consolidating a really promising left flank of the Democratic Party and left movement writ large throughout the country in the process. So I think that we are used to so much more visibility than we've necessarily earned as a left. We've had this extremely headline-grabbing presidential candidate, and we've racked up a few state and national level representative seats. And so I think that around when AOC was elected in 2018, I think that we were still really riding high. Bernie hadn't won, but it seemed as if a ton of people were going to be winning elections within a relatively short amount of time. There was still a thought that, maybe Bernie could be the pick in 2020 and that the left was going to be riding high. And I think that since that happened, we've had to recalibrate our understanding of the political terrain, of our place within it. And I think, if not become less optimistic, I think that we've had to grapple with reality a bit. And I think that part of grappling with reality is realizing just how hard the few elected representatives in Congress have it, and how much resistance they face within the party, and with such a large Republican Party actually trying to get anything done. So I think that the end of the AOC honeymoon is a little bit of a trolly and provocative title, but I think it's getting at a lot
Mm-hmm.
of ideas.
No, I mean, I thought this piece was really timely just because I felt like it was a very fair-minded sort of recalling of the history and maybe some of the like the. I mean, the thing with the AOC is like, Jesus. I mean, these past few years sort of feel like a decade, honestly. But she's only been in Congress. For a short amount of time, but yet really was defining part of what I don't know we could call like this resurgent left movement, DSA, the Jacobin sphere, what we're sort of experiencing right now. I mean, she's been a central piece to that. But I remember when she first got elected, and just being overwhelmed with joy. Rightfully so. I feel like, I mean, it was a really exciting moment, and especially because we didn't really have. A lot of power before that. And it was really exciting to see, even, okay, of course, in a very liberal district, but to be able to see somebody like AOC not only seeing a progressive, for example, beating an established candidate, but somebody who was, calling themselves a democratic socialist, was telling people to become a member of the DSA. And then almost immediately, I remember there's starting to be some tensions. Like, she gets elected, and these are small, kind of trivial things, right? But I remember this being a big deal, at least on the internet, when she's taking DSA out of her bio when she got elected. She did that pretty early on. And then you started to see these kind of two camps, people who I think were very enthusiastic about wanting to celebrate this success, and then a lot of people almost immediately coming at her for not sort of perfectly representing the movement. But anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. I mean, could you talk a little bit, because this in the history of this, I think, is really important, the piece, about that first campaign and sort of her relationship with the DSA itself as an organization?
Yeah. So, as a lot of your listeners, I'm sure know, DSA absolutely exploded in
Yeah.
2016. They started getting more members when Bernie was running. Their numbers started to tick up a little bit. And then after Trump got elected, there was just a huge influx. I personally was one of the members who, showed up. I lived in
Hmm.
LA at the time, showed up at one of the first meeting after the election, along with, dozens and dozens of new members. And that happened across the country. I don't remember the numbers, but definitely DSA became a much bigger deal and became, I think, the largest socialist organization in the United States since the beginning of the 20th century. So, pretty significant in that regard.
Hmm.
Um, so AOC was still not a member. She did run with a lot of there was a lot of electoral energy on the left, a lot of interest in women running for office
Hmm.
after Trump had won, particularly with the grab 'em by the pussy stuff. So she is someone who I think was pretty politicized over the past few years. She herself was a advisor. She then went to Standing Rock, I think, is something that she
Hmm.
hasn't talked as much about lately, but that was a part of her politicization in 2016 or so. And then she decided to run with the support of Justice Democrats, who started around that time, was also started by some Bernie organizers. And I believe that when she was already running, I forget how long into her campaign it was, but basically New York DSA, I think, got excited about her candidacy.
Hmm.
Here was this young working class Latina woman who was running a very unabashedly, uh, you know, progressive campaign, I think was how it was understood. But, they met with her and she agreed to join Say, and I think was using the right talking points. And I think that there was a lot of
Hmm.
energy. People thought this is a really exciting candidate. we are all new to this organization. We need a project. And anyone who's worked on a campaign, especially with DSA, it can be great for the candidate, but also great for the organization.
Hmm.
You get into a project together, you can recruit people, you develop capacity. So I think that all of those things coalesced, and they decided to endorse and campaign for her. And she won. She beat Joe Crowley in 2018, and then got into the House of Representatives in 2019. And I think that she was still learning a lot about the left, as were a lot of people on the left. So it was a very interesting, exciting, high energy time. And I think that they were excited about the extent to which she can grow the organization, and she certainly did. A lot of new members flooded into DSA after AOC as well, just like they had with Bernie's candidacy.
And I mean, Lord, she is still like an immensely popular, figure, and with people all across the country. I mean, she was just here in Texas, and was very much like was a celebrity. I mean, it was packed anywhere she spoke. People wanted to see her, right? And I think it's worthwhile understanding that. But I think this point that you keep on hitting on is that, you know, and this is just something that I think that some folks just haven't really reckoned with enough, that like, yes, DSA is an older organization, right? But functionally, when it comes to membership and influence, it's extremely young, in the sense that like the vast majority of people who have members have only been members for a couple of years. The vast majority of people who are members, it's the first real political organization that they've been a part of. The vast majority of members weren't even considering themselves to maybe be socialists, or even maybe even on the left before this, right? So there's a lot of development that's going on, and um, within the organization, that I think is really important to understand how we get into the situation where we're at now, where I think you're right to point to that, like, this starts with Bernie, and like this incredible, like, world historic opening on the American left,
Mhm.
for a different kind of politics to develop. But it was one of those things where you have a lot of growth very, very quickly, and we're now trying to catch up organizationally, to these platforms. And one of the maybe just to fast forward a little bit, one of the quotes that I really like, in the piece, let me get their name right. Michael, Michael Knuckin. I hope I'm saying that
And you
right.
can.
DSA.
Hmm.
Okay, thank you. A DSA organizer, sort of may use the metaphor of, AOC and these kind of large superstar politicians for organizations like DSA. It's sort of like riding a tiger. Could you sort of break that down a little bit for us?
Yeah, so I will just an aside, I think
Yeah.
Michael Knukin was someone who was so interesting and so insightful and had so much to say. And then one of the only things that ended up making it into the piece was this
I'm
goofy
sorry.
metaphor. So I just I think it was like a little jokey and offhanded, but I thought it totally made sense. So I don't know if
Yeah.
Michael listening, or I just hope people don't think that he's just a guy who goes around making goofy metaphors. But what I thought made a lot of sense about it is, yeah, like there is a bit of tension when you are, uh, especially working at the national level,
Mhm.
working with politicians who do have the potential to grow the organization, to help advance your goals. But their constituency is far broader than just DSA, right?
Mhm.
Like we don't control these people. We don't own them. They're pulled in a lot of political directions. They have bases that aren't necessarily fully aligned with us, etc. So the metaphor of you can ride the tiger. It will get you somewhere very fast. But I think we can also think of a few downsides to
Mhm.
riding a tiger, right? Like you can't control the tiger. You might get scratched. You're taking a bit of a leap of faith. And I think what I liked about that metaphor is I think that it captures the potential and the promise and the kind of excitement inherent to these kind of campaigns, especially when we're able to, endorse someone. A winning campaign is obviously a plus. Something about
Mhm.
riding the tiger. It's not all doom and gloom. It's kind of an exciting, unpredictable political thing with all of the pluses and minuses that entails. So I thought that really captured the essence of, how things felt politically at that moment and how they still feel to some extent, and
Mhm.
how DSA and broader left is trying to navigate these difficult things moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not expecting you to have all the answers here because these are like very real, live, strategic questions. But um, we're going to talk in a second about some of the more modern stuff about, Palestine, Iron Dome vote, things like that, or abstention, um, or present vote, whatever the terminology is. Um, and force the vote, right? But before we get there, I mean, I really wanted to hammer this down because you're somebody who writes for like a wide variety of left wing outfits. You talk to a lot of really smart strategists and people who are really in this. I mean, can you sort of help us sort of wrestle through this tension? Maybe I'll put my perspective on it first, and you can just sort of tell me what you think about it. It's like one of the things that's tough about AOC and a lot of these other figures who are associated with DSA
Mhm.
comes down to the fundamental tension within that organization, right? Which is that there's recognition about some of the kind of limitations to just sort of launching a third party right now. The way ballot access is sort of set up in this country, just the actual just sort of material barriers to creating a third party system in the United States, with the fact that like DSA also does not just want to turn into a pressure group either for the Democratic Party, right? Like it's an organization that very much is trying to articulate and develop a very specific kind of politics that, yeah, sometimes has a lot in common with progressives, but there is a line in the sand and a delineation. And it gets really fuzzy with some of the superstar candidates that we have up there, because as you note, and a lot of other people know, it's like our constituency is still, unfortunately, um, small, right? And I think that
Mhm.
what sort of frustrates me, and I'll throw it to you right now, but like what sort of frustrates me about some of the outside criticism that we get from folks is that some people sort of don't think that, or like have this idea, I guess, that people in DSA aren't aware of these kind of contradictions and tensions within the strategy, instead of these things actually being like very, very live and and engaging questions of debate within the organization, is not only how to deal with the members that you have now, but how to cultivate future elected officials both on the state and national level, and trying to have people have like a stronger connection with their local chapter or potentially state chapters as those are developing.
Mhm. Yeah, I think a lot of people from outside DSA very much misunderstand the organization. I think that's
Hmm.
true, and I also think that sometimes it gets missed with all of these intra DSA debates, which I think are healthy and matters to debate and discuss. I don't always think that that's done in a healthy or productive way, but certainly,
Hmm.
hashing these things out is important. And I think that sometimes the conversation had about these things leave out something very fundamental, which is, however you feel about third parties or working within the democratic system, et cetera, the left's primary problem is not electoral infrastructure or ballot access laws in a given state. Our problem is that we just don't have the power and don't have the numbers yet to really make those questions as relevant as we hope they'll point.
Hmm. Yeah, no, and I mean, one thing that our friend Ronan Burtonshaw, in the UK at Tribune has a line. I remember he was, at the beginning of the pandemic, right after Bernie had dropped out, when everything was feeling really, gloomy. Um, he, I thought, put it very clearly, what our
Mhm.
mission has to be, which is that you have to start to convince working class people that politics can change their lives. Like that's the community that I come from, working class communities in the South. I'm back home. I live in a working class community. I have neighbors. I talk to them a lot, and they love
Mhm.
things when I talk to them, like a lot of these kind of bread and butter democratic socialist platforms. But there is a whenever the conversation
Mhm.
turns to maybe doing something about it, or voting for somebody or something like that, it's like, well, why would I ever do that? Because there is like a kind of pessimism, I think, that is very, very prevalent, especially in the U.S., when it comes to politics, that like politics is, whenever politics comes into your life, it's like, well, this is bad, right? Because whenever like political change comes into your community, it usually means things are going to get worse, which is a pretty fair assessment for most working class people over the past 40 years. Um, yeah, and like those are like directly in front of us, though at the same time I think that it is important, that when we do have people who are defining us, it's on a national way, because like when people think about democratic socialists in this country, they think Bernie Sanders, they think AOC, maybe some people who are a little bit more plugged in, some of the other members of the squad, so there's a tension there too, though, where like I think that we have like these very material questions in front of us, but it is also sort of frustrating sometimes when you have a public figure sort of defining what our positions are on things, and it's sort of not really reflective, for example, of like what the membership of DSA thinks or is saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Ronan's point and your point about working class people and their interest in different political ideas not necessarily translating into voting behavior yet. I think that that's absolutely true.
Hmm.
I mean, I think another key reason that there is so much pessimism. I mean, the pessimism in a lot of ways is rational, right? Like, I
Hmm.
understand why people feel that way, especially when public goods have been so degraded and sabotaged with more and more paper over the years, more and more testing, experiences with government services in their lives are not anything close to what we would want out of a social project. And the base of DSA right now is very professional class, mostly college or college educated, and people bring in new members circles. So,
Hmm.
one of the biggest challenges will be developing a solidly base moving forward. As for Bernie and AOC, I think that one thing I tried to get at in the piece is that I don't think that AOC and the rest of the squad ordinary establishment Democrats. I think that arguments are
No.
unfair. But so far, their favorables either way do look like ordinary Democrats' favorables.
Mm.
People who like Democrats like AOC. People who don't like Democrats don't. And Bernie does have somewhat different favor. Bernie does have a little more support among people we wouldn't expect to like Democrats and vice versa. And so I think that shows there is potential. We just have to figure out how to tap into that.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I mean, we're gonna. I want to talk about force of the vote first. Then we're going to talk about Palestine and sort of her most recent trip here to Texas, because I thought that was an interesting. Um, I saw it with my own eyes, two different ways that can go. But before we get there, um, I think you're going to do this nicer than I will. So if you don't mind, I'm going to throw you the hot potato. Could you describe this force the vote, saga, because it is really important. Because I mean, uh, regardless of, I mean, it does matter what you thought about that debate, but it certainly has caused a rift that I can see amongst folks.
Mm-hmm.
And and I'm somebody who really, in the spirit of my friend and comrade Michael, want to see those kind of divides mended, and for us to be growing instead of fragmenting. But it really did highlight a certain view of politics. But anyways, I've pontificated enough. Could you tell us about this force the vote saga and what it sort of meant on a material level for AOC and that critique of her, essentially?
Yeah. So, force the vote was something that came to a head. I mean, I say came to a head like it was this long process, and I don't think it was. I think it kind of came up really suddenly out of some corners of this very online YouTube-y part of the left for the
Mm-hmm.
most part. Largely Jimmy Dore was, I think, one of the first people to point this out. They basically said that, okay, now that there several several strong left progressives in Congress. There are now more of them than there is the spread of Democrats versus Republicans. So, in order to keep her House Speaker position, Nancy Pelosi will need the votes of the squad. And what they should do is hold their votes for her for Speaker in exchange for a floor vote for Medicare for all. To be charitable to them, I think the idea was that they believed that this could be a massive grand spectacle, which in the context of the ongoing pandemic would inevitably this massive, powerful groundswell toward Medicare for all, and get us closer to achieving it. A lot of people didn't find those arguments too convincing, including myself. And I think that the battles, the battle lines were drawn. There was a whole lot of bitterness, ugliness being hurled in both directions. In both directions, but I do think that people with the YouTube channels, maybe it's a certain audience, but I think that there was just a whole of vindictiveness and anger and ugliness coming from force the vote people. And what I think that it reflects, and wrote a piece, is that I think that a lot of the vote people basically tried to make the argument from their fact that force the vote didn't happen, shows that see and the rest of the side are the reason that you don't have health care. They're no different than Nancy Pelosi office by saying all the right things, and now they're completely co-opted by the establishment. Dingle dingle do. And so I think that sort of more abstractly, I think, amounts to a split over what those politicians are for, and what they should be doing with their elected office.
And there's a couple. I mean, I don't want to relitigate that whole argument again, but there's a couple things that I think are worth noting. From my perspective on it, was that I think sometimes people mistake spectacle, particularly media spectacle, for politics. And I think it's not surprising that, people who do what I do, are the people who are really pushing it, because it's all about if we just have the right frame for the argument, right, then we'll get this, we'll get this thing that we want, which is not really reflective of how political change happens. Political change happens from organizing, building constituencies, and building power. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be critical, for example, of people who are elected to represent, a certain movement. For fuck's sake, I mean, we do that vast majority. When we talk about AOC, particularly on this show, it's usually about something that we think that she's done wrong. But I will say that there is also only so much of the typical congressional schedule that sort of trickles down into mass media. And what I mean by that is people are like, well, what is AOC doing? And it's well, there are constant votes that are happening. There are constant moves that are happening. And look, it might not always be the most radical thing, but AOC really does, along with other members of the squad, do at times stand up for very, very important progressive legislation, or cut down really, really nasty pro-austerity. They're having them, even if they're not getting us the big stuff, right? There are these kind of they might seem small, in the grand scope of things, but they add up and they can be really meaningful. And I think that a lot of people don't see that in the same way that, when you watch a presidential campaign, they're constantly being asked about their positions on things, right? Where Congress and, these things, they're not sexy, they're not big spectacles. So it's really easy to sort of miss the value, for example, of having this small cohort, it also should be noted, in Congress. They do use their power when they have the ability to. I think there could certainly be more that's being done, et cetera, et cetera. But also, then the second thing is the one everybody knows. It's like at this point, putting up a doomed Medicare for all vote, even if you get your way, I think is just extremely harmful. One, because if you know anything about this party, it is quite vicious with dealing with its left flank, and I think to do it, to sort of put yourself out there for something like that,
Mhm.
that again would just be symbolic at the end of the day, is a mistake. And beyond all of that, right? If you really, 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 really want something to happen, I think the solution should be, not to hyper focus on AOC and the small segment of people that we have in office, is actually to expand this base or the bench, right? So then it doesn't matter so much, for example, like what one person does, right? Or what, oh, did she wear the dress or whatever, right? Like if you're annoyed with the way that AOC might sort of act or things she says in public, and you're a socialist, like what you should really be focusing on is like how to expand the amount of elected officials who are democratic socialists in Congress and state houses, so that we don't have to hyper focus and have our whole movement sort of associated with one human being, who's going to have a wide variety of different personal opinions and antics and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think all that tracks, and I think part of why Force the Vote felt so intuitively correct to certain people, particularly
Hmm.
people who are, more into the left media, is, to be fair to them, in some ways, that was kind of Bernie's gamut in
Hmm.
2016, right? Like he ran, and in so doing, I think uh, part of his calculus and part of what happened was to get these arguments out there, was to
Hmm.
spark a fight in people, was to not leave everything that Hillary and establishment Democrats say completely to have someone articulating this strong class inflected sense of point of view. Like I think that that's kind of how he used, and so then people understood the fight to be very, very media driven, very
Hmm.
rhetorical,
Yeah.
and I understand that. But I think that I think that people forget that, as far as I understood it, the promise of Bernie's candidacy was that his arguments, his visibility was going to help consolidate the political factors that would be able to eventually
Hmm.
overcome the forces of the establishment Democrats and liberalism,
Yeah. And
right? Like that's going to take a movement. That's going to take
oh, no, you
going
cut
to
out.
take
No,
a
but
movement. That's
we
going to
got
take.
what you said. Like, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, and, and
okay,
and God love
cool.
Bernie Sanders. I mean, we all wouldn't be doing the things that we're doing if it wasn't for him. I mean, I will say there's part of me, and I don't mean to be critical of somebody who's done so too critical of somebody who's done so much. I do sometimes wish that he'd do more to help us with directing people into these organizations now. The thing about Bernie that was so fascinating was that like his analysis has been for the most part 100% accurate. Like even when he was running, right, he would remind people, if I get into power, right, that's just the beginning of the fight. Like we're going to need mass movements, mass mobilizations of people to be able to overcome all of these parts of just like like not to use Trump terms, but like the state apparatus, right, the party apparatus within the Democratic Party that are going to be hurdles, even if we have the majorities, right. Is like he recognized this kind of fundamental thing, and there's a tragedy there. It's like, well, I don't think we had really developed them at that point when he was making that argument, but like there was an understanding there, that I think some people didn't really heed, except for the kind of great slogan, but are you willing to fight for somebody that you don't know? Didn't really get recognized that like that. No, that actually means like being in an organization. It's a little bit different from just like, I don't know, consuming independent media. And there's been a whole host and explosion of independent media, which I think is very, very good. Don't get me wrong, but there's this kind of, as you were mentioning earlier, like this kind of fixation on on the media solely as like, oh, well, the media is why we're not in power, right? If we had better media, Bernie Sanders would be president. I promise y'all, I hate to say it, but
Mhm.
if we had like Jacobin, MSNBC, our media coverage would probably be a lot better in this country. But I don't think we would necessarily be any closer to a Bernie Sanders victory, for example, in 2020. And I think it can be a little self-serving for people to make that argument. But I wanted to because we're going on a little bit longer than I said, so I want to make sure that we get to this because I think it is important. And I think that you're seeing a kind of development, though, of dealing with DSA and how we want to deal with our candidates, and that comes with the question of Palestine. There was the Jamal Bowman,
Mhm.
what you call it, the Jamal Bowman affair. The Jamal Bowman moment where Bowman basically has pretty not the worst, but unacceptable for organizations that support Palestinians views on Palestine, and we can't rehash the entire story here, but I'll just remind people, essentially what happens is, Bowman continues, to put out bad statements and bad votes on Palestine. The organization sort of tries to call him out on this. There's a big fight within the DSA. There's basically from the National Political Committee a decision that if Bowman doesn't change his positions, they won't re-endorse him for the next cycle. There's been some positive
Mhm.
movement on this where Bowman actually has come a little bit closer to, I think, the official DSA position on these things. But you're seeing this as like a growing pains, and I also wanted to note I have to see the Bowman moment in the context of what happened here in Austin with Greg Casar, who I think is a candidate who I'd been really, really excited about for a very long time because I think in a lot of ways he's the real deal. He really does fight for working people, comes from that background. He got his background in organizing, immigrant labor in Texas. This isn't somebody who just like saw a political movement growing. This is somebody who is deeply invested in it, was a DSA member. But he himself ended up having, again, pretty, again, not the worst views on Palestine, but out of step with the DSA position. And, the DSA here, effectively, there's some technicalities here, but effectively, he was unendorsed. And I agree with that decision, even though it's really difficult. But on the Palestine question, we are seeing this within the organization, the development of some sort of capacities to deal with elected officials or candidates. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, I think that the Bowman issue with Palestine is interesting and more difficult. The vote, I mean,
mhm,
force the vote. Personally, I thought was a straightforward bad idea. I didn't the point. I didn't think it would be a positive thing. If anything, it would be a net neutral or possibly net negative for all. Whereas I think that what people in DSA are asking of women and of other elected officials, which is to support Indian solidarity, I think that that's a good thing. And so I think that that
mhm,
makes these questions a lot harder. The thing that when I was reporting that about Bowman, that I kind of put the issue into perspective for me was that in the weeks leading up to his Iron Dome he voted to
mhm,
expand Iron Dome funding as opposed to just voting present, even like AOC did. So that was a bad vote. And leading up to that vote, he got zero call constituents about
mhm,
Palestinian solidarity, and many calls from constituents about supporting Israel. I think that shows the which these elected officials have large constituencies,
mhm,
and they are serving other people. I staunchly believe that given DSA's other agenda items and the other things on our platform, I'm still so happy that Jamal Bowman than Elliot Engel is in that seat. I think that
Yeah.
that's important. I think that if we have, I think if we have an attitude that is, well, be no one, if it can't be someone who's perfectly aligned with every single thing, I think that that's just politically incoherent. I think that makes no sense. But that's a separate from, how do we relate to people and endorse them and work alongside of our endorsed candidates. And I know that this feels like
Mhm.
a wig cop out, but I think that my only real answer to that is that it has to be something that we decide on a cases. I think that it sounds very morally powerful to say that we have to stick with rules in every single and um, I, I guess I don't know many things in life that are that way.
Well, Natalie, that was really perfect. I mean, Jesus, there's so much we could still get to. I mean, these are the fun questions to have as a movement, right? Is how to build our power and what to do with our success, and start looking to the long term of how we can get even better. Um, I really appreciate you joining us. People should definitely follow Natalie's work. You can read her New Republic, Jacobin, Prospect, everywhere. She writes about really smart socialist things to debunking very, very funny Havana Syndrome stuff. So everybody check out her work. And thank you so much for hanging out tonight, Natalie. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I hope y'all enjoyed that. I mean, it's funny, sort of, again, as I was noting, remembering the timeline, that there are so many strategic and organizational questions, to be had looking just at this short 4-year period of history, from AOC, really being the first of, the most notable arms of the organization, of the DSA, and where we're at now. And by no means is it sort of perfect or settled. I mean, these questions are still very, very open. I mean, my position still is that we need to be certainly, we need to be expanding our movement in terms of numbers, but we also need to be expanding our movement in terms of building democratic power. And I think that it is important to try to build not just relationships, but actually real structures between a base of an organization and elected officials. The reality of the situation that we've been in, because of decades and decades of just destruction on the American left, the destruction of really any kind of formation of a socialist party or really third party in this country, puts us into a difficult moment where, we are able to ride on the successes of certain important national figures, um, while we might not have actually the structural capacity, to present ourselves in a kind of coherent political line like you would have if it was a more proper political party. I mean, I very much think that is the project, is to build that. But this is the in between period. This is the period where we're trying to find ways to build our power, and also to set ourselves up for the long term when we aren't so reliant, for example, on a few individuals. And I think, as I said in the interview, that one of the most important tasks that we have in front of us is to expand to a point where we're not so reliant on somebody like AOC, who, as we noted in the piece, was a member of DSA, but was only there for a little while before sort of getting catapulted into Congress. And you can see it in the way that she talks about socialism. You can see it in the way that she talks about Palestine. That there's a lot of um, there's a lot of empty space in some of the places that we should have had more political education there, so that she would be a much stronger advocate for us on these things. And it's also important on our end to be self-reflective as to why we're not able to get our way in the sense. And as Natalie noted, it's the fact that Bowman was getting a bunch of calls from people telling him to vote a certain way on Israel, and he wasn't getting anyone calling him to act the other way, right? That doesn't excuse anything. That doesn't mean that we should support it or be happy with it. And I think, working to build up ways to discipline a member of the organization who was making horrific votes on an apartheid state. Let's be real about what we're talking about here. That is understandable, but also understanding the power analysis and the structural analysis too. That is why we're in the position that we're in. We need to be building up not just a larger bench, but an organization that is more powerful, so that we're the phone call that gets picked up first, and we're making that call. But yeah, I mean, there's so much that we weren't even able to get to just because of constraints of time and some technical issues. But I don't think that the AOC question is going to go away, nor do I think that it should. But I would just suggest, in light of the conversation that we had, that we try to root ourselves in a spirit of actually looking to build an organization rather than just kind of like media spectacle and thinking about politics as an individual game. Because one of the most dangerous things, as I noted at the beginning of the show, is taking this kind of individualistic approach to politics. We have to think in collectives. We have to think as members of class, and we have to think as members of an organization. And one of the most important things that can be happening right now is for all the disparate voices that we have out there to be organized in a kind of coherent organization where these fights are actually happening, not only in just like a constructive way, in the sense that we're being friendly and comradely with each other, but in a way that there's actually something that will happen on the other side. Because you can win the debate online, you can win the debate with your friends, but if you're not in an organization that has any power or ability to enact things, for example, that you're winning a debate on, you know I mean, it's nice, it's fun to win, but we want to do much, much bigger things than to win kind of squabbles with one another. Um, but yeah, I mean, people who are fans of the show and watch the show know we talk about these things all the time, and you know, um, there's a hell of a lot more questions that need to be answered. I mean, Matt and I's position, for example, too, is that there does need to be more of a delineation, I think, between that side of the movement, the squad, for example, and what we mean as democratic, what we mean when we say that we're democratic socialists, or that we're socialists, right? I also do think that, as Matt said, that it's important that the demand starts to get heard, that we can't be fundraising for people who are going to be donating money to reactionary Democrats. I think that is actually something that's a critique that I think has a lot of legs, and we should be examining and taking that much, much more seriously. But anyways, I can't be able to get to everything. But if you want more, and to be able to hang out with me and our comrade Ben Burgess on the other side of the post game, please subscribe at patreon.com/left reckoning. We're going to be taking voicemails. Do I have that number up? I mean, you can leave us a voicemail at 1-940-289-7234. That's only played on the premium side. So leave us a voicemail and sign up at patreon.com/left reckoning. I'll see y'all, I think, probably 15 minutes. I'm gonna be quick this time. Usually we're a little slow, but I'll be quick. I'll see y'all in just a couple minutes. And take care. Solidarity, everybody. And I'm going to be off on vacation next week. But Matt Leck will be here. Hopefully he does as good a job as I did. And I'll see y'all very, very, very soon.